Welcome to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, where I cover topics and issues that will help you take a stand for Christ in culture. More than ever, followers of Jesus need courage to stand up, speak up, and to live out their faith, because people need to know that there's a God in heaven that loves them, and it is His truth that sets people free. Thanks for listening today, and I hope that you enjoyed the episode. Hey, I want to welcome everybody to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, and today I have with me special guest, Dr. Brittany LeBoeuf, and I want to welcome you again, young lady, to the podcast. Thanks for being a part.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to chat again.
Yeah. So we're going to jump right into it. I want to just talk a little bit about the transgender moment that we're living through, and kind of say on the front end that the church should be loving and grace-filled towards transgender people, but we must stand against transgender ideology. And so what I'd like to do kind of in this podcast is talk about some of these realities. I think it was maybe 2 years ago, I did a series called Biblical Biology, and just talking about that the Bible is binary. There's very clear categories. Creation is incredibly clear, and it's clear in science as well, but it gets muddied now in this cultural revolution that we are living through. And so I'd like to just talk about for a few moments. Let me just set this up before I ask you a bunch of questions, and we'll kind of go through this discussion. I just want on the front end, all Christians believe this. Now, some are woke, apostate, progressive. They don't believe the Bible is accurate. They don't believe it's infallible. It's just words by men, and we only believe certain parts, which is just a counterfeit to Christianity. We're warned of these things throughout the New Testament. It goes back to the book of Genesis. Did God really say that? But I just want to say on the front end that God only created two genders. Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. That has not been an arguable thing until the last 20 seconds or so in culture. Jesus added to that because Jesus often quotes the Old Testament because he's the author of the Old Testament, which is another discussion. But the Bible teaches that men are men. I have my Make Men Men Again shirt on. A female is a woman. But we have in this cultural revolution a redefinition of terms and an appeal to the experts, which is always interesting, whatever the expert of the moment is saying. And so what I'd like to do is kind of talk about and flesh this out a little bit and have you speak to and give some answers that people can give as we're living through this, because all of culture is being confused. All children are being sexualized. All social norms are being upended. And so we have to have clarity over confusion in these moments. So why don't you go ahead and just say some opening thoughts as we jump into this topic?
Yeah, so for those of you who maybe don't know me or know my story, that biblical biology series that you did a couple of years ago, as someone who was coming out of sort of feminism and some of the mindset around what I would say is critical theory as a big umbrella term, this is a really important distinction, and they are all related, which I don't think a lot of people necessarily realize or are willing to admit, that all of these things are related and the ideology is confused throughout. So making sure that we define terms and define what people mean and having them define terms is a critical part of these conversations from the very beginning. Yeah. Because there are a lot of words that sound the same, but when two different people are using them, they may not mean the same thing. And so my goal, hopefully, as we have this discussion, is to how to have effective conversations about this, because it is a very emotionally charged conversation, or at least it can be, depending on who you're talking to. So we'll give some definitions, and we'll explain kind of where we're coming from all of these all these different terms. But it's important to keep that in mind as you're reading things, as you're thinking through things, as you see things that the government puts out, what the definitions are and what they mean, and then remember the basis from which it's coming from.
So it popped up on my Facebook today. That was 2 years ago. We had a bridal shower. And I sent it over to you before this podcast, a bridal shower for my daughter, and that was the the day that the Holy Spirit got a hold of you and started doing a work in your life. And, before that, you were getting swept up in the cultural revolution, Black Trans Lives Matter TikToks and, all of those things. And so you, with your study and even some of your background, I know you have some interesting perspective and things to say. But before we jump into that, I wanted to quote, there's a guy by the name of Paul McHugh. He said, "Transgendered men do not become women, nor do transgendered women become men, but all become feminized men or masculinized women, counterfeits or impersonators of the sex with which they identify." And the reality is we would never think of treating anorexia with liposuction. And we shouldn't try to help people that are confused about their sexuality by entering into the delusion, the lie, as Romans 1 talks about. And I think in these discussions, before we try to lead with empathy, which I don't care for that word because I think it's so loaded. I prefer sympathy and compassion, but if you're going to use the term empathy, it needs to be rooted in Scripture. But in being understanding and loving towards people, I think we have to begin with truth. And as Christians, followers of Jesus, having an understanding, not just what someone is going through, that's important, that's fine, but having an understanding of truth. Because if you don't have that understanding of truth, you cannot help someone appropriately. Maybe say a few words about that.
Yeah, so I think it's really easy for us to approach every conversation as if first of all, that this transgenderism issue is a lot more common and prevalent than it actually is. Because it's so in our face, I think we're led to believe that like half the population right now is transgender, and that's
Yeah.
the goal. Is
Yeah.
in the framework of critical theory, they want you to believe that the oppressed, quote unquote, oppressed group needs to rise in power in order for the tide to be changed. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important, one, to remember that this is a very, very, very small portion of the population, even though they'd like it to be much larger, which is why it's shifting from just seeing it in adults to seeing it in children. And there's a lot to unpack there. I also agree that the term empathy has been weaponized and means something completely different than what we want it to. And to have a seed, it may start with a seed of truth. The goal for us as Christians is to be able to find that seed of truth and hopefully start the conversation there rather than what it's been zoomed out to be, some sort of, I don't know, popularized saying or law that's being pushed or whatever. Start with what people actually believe is true. They don't want you to do that. As in the culture, doesn't want you to do that because you don't need a PhD in gender studies to know that there are males and females.
Yeah. I
You
don't think
don't need
anyone
that.
needs a
They're
PhD in
out
gender
there.
studies, but yeah.
Yeah, you don't need to be. I mean, children know this.
Yes.
It's very common sense knowledge, but it's getting beat into us that you need to have this certain level of special knowledge or Gnosticism about gender that you need to be able to be able to say anything. And
Yeah.
I'm just going to encourage you all right now that you do not. And if someone tells you that, kindly say, I don't need to know that. I have a brain. I can think. I know that there are males and females, period. It's not that complicated.
Yeah.
And honestly, just saying that and being able to stand up to being the pushback on that is a big first step. And one that unfortunately many people aren't even willing to do right now.
Yeah. And that's true. So I just want to go through a couple thoughts here real quick. Number one, God created two genders. Genesis 1:27, as I mentioned earlier. Matthew 19:4-6. Jesus answered them. He said, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female?" So God created. He created us male and female. He created us for family. Marriage should be male and female. All these things. Number two, God created you the way he wanted you. Your biological sex is the way he wanted you. Psalm 139 reminds us that he formed and fashioned us in our mother's womb. Now, there's imperfections that occur and challenges within our life because of sin and the brokenness and everything. There's all sort of confusion, which leads to deceptions. That's satanic. There's also sickness and disease that are part of the fall, but the reality is that God's design and his desire for us is ultimately still the same. And I just want to say, to change your gender is to assume the role of God. Ephesians 2 says we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus. Now, it's a postmodern thought where, all rational modern thought is discarded and we're just led by feelings and there's no objective truth. Another statement I want to make before we jump into this next part is your biology determines your behavior. Genesis 1:28 says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Now, the enemy is trying to change this. I was just reading an article before I jumped on this podcast by Dr. Deborah So. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She has a really excellent book that is out, and she was talking about science in the near future is going to permit womb transplants, which will enable potentially men to carry babies in their stomach, even though they're biologically, not capable in every way, shape, or form. But the amount of confusion and things that brings, it's assuming the role of God. And we got to remember that body, soul, and spirit are one cohesive unit. And ultimately, the transgender movement, the ideology, is in defiance to God. God didn't create. God's not in charge. You can be whatever you want to be. And I think it's important for a Christian to start there in this culture, just to know the basics of truth. It's not complicated, like you said. The Scripture is not. You don't need to have a degree or know Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. You should know how to study the Bible, which is another topic, but so important. So within that, let's kind of jump in and talk about these ideas, because I want to help people be able to think through and communicate. So whether it's a young person to listen to this that's in school, that's being bombarded with critical queer theory, critical gender theory, which all comes from the poison fruit of critical theory, which you mentioned is it categorizes everyone into the oppressor or the oppressed. And you need to elevate the oppressed, and the oppressed will never understand. Of course, nobody articulates what happens when the oppressed all of a sudden become the oppressors. I guess we got to start all over again. But within all that, or just older people at their jobs that are being asked to sign on, like, you need to be an advocate. Like if a dude wears a dress, you need to be really excited about that and celebrate that because they're brave. And that's what we were taught by culture, right? Bruce Jenner decided to become, pretend to be a woman, leave his family and change everything. And he's celebrated for ruining his family and was made one of the more, a hero. I remember on the ESPY Awards and all those things, which helped me stop paying attention to sports years ago. But within all that, let's jump in and kind of walk through. And I want you to lead us through, what is transgenderism, gender dysphoria, rapid onset gender dysphoria, some of these different things. Well, what's the body of work that's out there? What are people saying? What should the response be to kind of help us understand this?
Yeah, so I think to start, I think many people feel like this came out of nowhere because it wasn't, to them, it wasn't prevalent until it was. But in actuality, we've been being primed for years as a culture, and in the academic fields, this is not anything new.
Yeah.
This concept of transgenderism or having gender dysphoria, which they're kind of separate things. When we're talking about this, I'm going to talk about what gender dysphoria is. There's not necessarily the same thing as transgender ideology, which is the ideology is pushing it onto everyone, making it embedded in our culture and forcing everyone to have the viewpoint of justice for transgender people is the goal. That's
Yeah.
different from someone who is suffering from gender dysphoria, which it is a very real disorder. So I don't want to act like it isn't. And, I can give a formal definition according to the DSM, which is what psychiatrists, psychologists, for those of you who aren't familiar, that's what they use to categorize mental illnesses. And so up until very recently, gender dysphoria was defined very specifically. And for someone to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, they had to have experienced incongruence between their sex body and what they believed their gender to be. But even that, they've changed the language of this term. They've changed the definition, what qualifies as gender dysphoria, but traditionally this would have had to be prolonged for at least 6 months
Mm,
for someone to have gender dysphoria. And this could be presented from a lot of different things, but I'll point out a few that may make your like kind of raise your eyebrows, like that's gender dysphoria. A strong preference for cross gender roles in make believe or fantasy play. A strong preference for toys, games, or activities that are stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender. A strong preference for playmates of the other gender. In boys, a strong rejection of masculine toys, games, etc. So if anyone's listening to this and they're like, that's my toddler, you're probably right, because all of these behaviors are very, very common and are not, in my opinion, do not signify any sort of disorder that's happening. It's very
yeah.
developmentally appropriate for little boys and little girls to be curious about toys that are around them, to have friends that are the opposite gender, and to them it's completely innocent. It is nothing to be concerned about. But what we've done is we've labeled that as some sort of disorder, and
Yeah.
in an attempt to abolish stereotypes, which was one of the goals of feminism, what we've actually done is made more rigid stereotypes, so that
Mm,
if you go outside the bounds of these traditional roles, it could be that it's because you are actually the other gender, and not just that you're maybe a little bit more, have some more masculine characteristics or interests as a woman.
yeah.
That's null and void now. Now you're a trans man, if that is you. And especially with children, you can imagine this is pretty dangerous territory.
Yep. And before you go forward on that, I mean, I just think of my own children over the years. They're now a little bit older. The youngest are teenagers. But I think of them growing up and today's climate. A boy plays with a Barbie. A boy has, whatever. We used to tease
Hmm.
and joke they put on the princess outfits that their sister would have, and it was just funny. Now they'd
Hmm.
be saying, hey, you should get them on some cross sex hormones and really consider, transing them, like changing
Yep.
them, which is super dangerous. So we are in this moment of insanity that's being promoted and propagated and propagandizing children. You think about children just for a moment. I mean, I tell my kids this and teaching them, maybe this will help someone. We would babysit little kids from time to time, friends' children, and I'd say, can you imagine like telling this child that we would babysit, trying to convince them that they're a boy or a girl? You could pretty much convince them that they're anything because they're kids. And that's what makes this so diabolical and so evil. But anyway, I digress. Let's continue on.
Yeah, and you'll see that it's very common on social media. For example, you'll see adults suggesting the idea of gender transition to very young children, which is very irresponsible. And just, I have no words for people who do that. But
Yeah.
in most cases, the kids aren't coming up with this idea on their own. And in that case, it's really not true gender dysphoria. It's they're trying to appease their caretaker, the adult
Yeah.
in their life who is supposed to be caring for them and shielding them from these things. Instead, they're getting these ideas from the adult. And what that is creating is this phenomenon that has been coined rapid onset gender dysphoria, which this we see this primarily in young adolescent girls, because the research
Hmm.
shows that up until quite recently, most of the time when we see transgenderism at play, it's actually boys believing that they're girls. And up until very recently, now we see that there is this influx all of a sudden of pubescent, prepubescent young girls identifying as boys. And
Mm.
Abigail Schreier outlines this in her book, Irreversible Damage, which is
Yeah.
a great read for any of you who want to learn more about this as well. Is that all of a sudden we're seeing several girls identifying as boys, and the reasoning for that is unclear, but one suggested theory is that it's based on what we call a social contagion, meaning that you see these groups of girls where one starts to identify as trans or as part or as just a member of the LGBT community, and very quickly many of the friends in their peer group also identify as a LGBT something in that community.
Hmm.
And this social contagion phenomenon is nothing new. It's something that's well respected in many areas of research. I know for me personally, I studied this for physical activity in kids, because also at that age, what we notice is that girls, because they are so uncomfortable in their bodies as they're going through puberty, because they're adjusting to transitioning into middle and high school, we often see this discomfort, and it often leads to a decrease in physical activity. So that's what I was studying when I was looking at social contagions, is like, what are the behaviors in these girls that contribute to obesity? And there are very real social constructs that can influence that, yes. But what we're seeing with the transgender ideology is it's largely social media based, as in social media is influencing their beliefs about these behaviors and even exposing them to things that they never knew about before. And
Yeah.
so we're just now seeing the impacts of this. And anyone who wants to quote the science of it is very much in its infancy in some ways.
Hmm.
And the data that we do have is actually oppositional to what we are being told is what we should, how we should correct for this with transitioning and all of that. So I'll just pause there.
No, that's really
You
good.
can,
I was just thinking of, I have this quote from, it's a really good book by Ryan T. Anderson. It's called When Harry Became Sally, which is funny name, but responding to the transgender moment. And one of the quotes is, and there's a few quotes I might use in this podcast. He said, "The people increasingly in the spotlight of the transgender moment are children. In 2007, Boston Children's Hospital became the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children and adolescents, as its website brags. A decade later, more than 45 pediatric gender clinics had opened their doors to our nation's children. Parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. It's terrible emotional manipulation. Never mind that the best studies of gender dysphoria, studies that even transgender activists cite, show that between 80 and 95% of children who express a discordant gender identity will come to identify with their bodily sex if natural development is allowed to proceed. So if we don't manipulate them, in other words, it'll just work itself out for the majority of people.
yeah.
A lot of this comes from gender theory, queer theory. Maybe we can jump in and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So a lot of the research that has been done in these areas, like you're saying, even sometimes transgender activists will reference the research without fully understanding what the findings are. Um, and to your point about children growing out of it, that's very common. And I think it's up until like age 12. If you don't do anything, most kids will just grow out of this. In the literature, that's often called desistance, I believe is how you say it. I've only read the words. I don't actually know how to say it. But desistance is when they stop identifying or stop experiencing these feelings, and as a result of not doing anything, social transition, any of that. And so this does all lead back to queer theory and some of the underpinnings and the people who are responsible for pushing queer theory forward. And once I learned about how absolutely abhorrent the research was that was done to create some of these findings, it really, for me personally, changed my perspective on just how evil this is. There are very prominent researchers and psychiatrists. One of them is John Money. And I encourage everyone who's listening to this to just do a quick Google search of this man. And you will find that much of the work that he did, and this idea of changing language, of gender being different from sex, all of these things, this was his work and that he published way back in the 1950s. And
Mm-hmm.
so this isn't really that new if you were familiar with the work that he did. And in those spaces, people who are studying queer theory or prominent queer theory activists, they know this and agree with it. They believe that a gender is completely separate from sex, that you can choose your gender, it's all social construct. However, I will say what's interesting is that one of the main underpinnings of that is that he did believe some things were sexed, in that only men could impregnate, but women could menstruate and carry children, all of that, which now even that's being questioned. So at the time, it was, there are certain things that can only be biological, but everything else is socially constructed, which is only half true because, like I said before, there are such thing as social constructs. That is true, but that doesn't mean that they're all bad and that they all need to be rejected. And when it comes to gender specific social constructs, some of them aren't social constructs at all, like the ability to reproduce and how you reproduce, whether you can be impregnated or get someone pregnant. That is very specific to whether you're a male or a female, for example.
Yeah.
So it's a kernel of truth in that, yes, there are some things that are socially constructed, but some things aren't, and not all of it just needs to be smashed, so to speak.
Yeah. Can you just, I like to define terms, and someone might be listening and say, okay, I hear this term, social construction, and all these things, and I know what construction is because I built a house or whatever, but it confuses me. Just kind of define that for a moment. What is that, and what does that mean? How does that play out?
So, a social construct is something that you are not necessarily born with. Many people are probably familiar with nature versus nurture.
Hmm.
What are inherent characteristics to someone versus what is a product of the environment that they are around? And so this could be from anything. I'll give the example for physical activity, like I was talking about before, because a lot of people are familiar with this. A social construct around physical activity for, let's say, for women is that women shouldn't get sweaty or participate in activity because they're women.
Yeah.
That's an example of a social construct that one is has been proven false because it's
Hmm.
very healthy for everyone to exercise, for example, but it would have been considered totally normal and accepted to cite that as a reason to not participate in this thing. I don't know, 50 years ago. So that's an example of a social construct. It's
Okay.
not anything that you can necessarily. It's not tangible,
Hmm.
which is why many people try to argue that everything is a social construct because it's not necessarily something that you can point to and say it's true or untrue. It's something that's more manifested in our culture.
Yeah.
And they change over time.
You had mentioned John Money, and I thought Matt Walsh did a good job of highlighting this in his documentary, What is a Woman, which I highly recommend people watch. So, John Money, we know that what he did related to gender, not far from here, Johns Hopkins University Hospital, actually caused the death and suicide of those twins, but that's another discussion. Alfred Kinsey, most people don't know that name, but have been impacted by it because most of our teachings around sex in our government school system is all based on the Kinsey Research Institute and their findings. You want to say something about him before we go on?
I have a lot I could say about him, but to summarize his work and what he thought about children is he believed, and his work reflected this, that children were inherently sexual beings and that children could experience sexual pleasure, and the experiments that he conducted were to test just that. What if you could think of the most disgusting type of research that you could imagine. For me, it's just like one of the most disgusting things I could even imagine is testing the sexuality of little children, and I'm talking like toddlers and younger even.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm not going to go into detail, but some of the experiments that he did were just absolutely awful.
Yeah.
And he cited this very openly. You can Google him; it will probably come right up. Some of the experiments that he did, but he believed that children could experience sexual pleasure, and his experiments were designed to test just that. So when we talk about the fathers of the sexual revolution and all of that, and being not only accepting but promoting it, that was all of you talk about, Planned Parenthood and their um, the way that they want to teach sexuality to kids. That is the basis of it, and his research and the people who did research like him are responsible for creating this whole area. And once you understand that, I would argue that it'd be, for me, how do you defend that is what I
Hmm.
would like to know. If someone does try, I would like them to defend that to me.
Yeah.
If they believe that this is correct, I would like them to explain why, it is ethical, why it makes any sense, and why it's not completely immoral to do this type of research on children and then relate it back to what's happening now with all of the gender dysphoria and pushing the transgender ideology onto young kids,
Yeah.
because you can draw a line to that. And
Yeah.
if you don't agree with one, then explain to me how you agree with the other.
And I don't want to go too far on this thought, but in the 1950s, Kinsey put out some books. One was The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and then followed up, he had more work that he had done, but research. And if you go back and learn a little bit about what he did, he had relationships with pedophiles who would molest and sexualize and just deviant behavior with children, and then they would write detailed notes about the outworking of that, and then he put that in his book. And that book then was pushed it was the seeds of the sexual revolution in the 1960s. And that's why it's so important that we understand the ideologies that are being pushed and foisted on us culturally, because this was pushed out throughout the 1950s and accepted mainstream in every way, and it brought about the complete wreckage of family and norms through the sexual revolution, which caused so much devastation, and we're living through another aspect of that right now. But let's continue on there's a couple things. I want to get to the arguments in just a moment, but anything that you wanted to say related to studies on gender dysphoria or social contagion, and then we'll go into the common arguments.
Yeah, so a lot of the narrative that I feel like is presented in the mainstream media is that either they admit that there's a lack of research, or they overstate or misinterpret the findings of that research, or leave out certain areas of research. And in the scientific community, it is a red flag if there have been a multitude of studies done and the findings are so clear cut so early on that there's no sort of alternative thought process. And the way that happens is kind of tricky, because in order to get something published in an academic journal, it needs to go through what's called peer review. So a group of reviewers will read and send you feedback for the article that you're proposing to be published. And if you don't change it, they won't publish it. And what we're finding with anything that goes against this narrative that they've already decided needs to be pushed forward, which is that gender affirmative care is the answer. This is what's best. This is what prevents suicide. This is what's healthy for everyone. Da, 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 da. If there are studies that come out basically with alternative findings, those researchers are often dragged through the mud. Their reputations are tarnished. They're thought to be some sort of I don't know, not someone that you can trust in the scientific
Mm-hmm.
community. And we've seen this play out a couple of times, notably with Dr. Lisa Littman, who her research was quoted a lot in Abigail Schreier's book. And she wasn't a conservative Christian or anything. She was a liberal college professor who was just publishing the findings that she had observed in her research, which is what good scientists do.
Mm-hmm.
And she was dragged through the mud. Her reputation was completely tarnished. We've seen this several other times as well, which one disincentivizes even doing research on this population, but also it muddies the water as far as what is actually true, because we're only getting one sort of side of this story, and any alternative findings are not being published. And so using science as a reason, or citing science as a reason to promote gender transition and promote transgender ideology, to me, isn't a very strong argument, because there's only certain research that's allowed to be cited, even though we have bodies of research from since Alfred Kinsey's days and John Money, we have research on these individuals. And that's where we know the things like, yeah, if you just leave them alone, many people their feelings of gender dysphoria will go away by the time that they're an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And there are several studies to kind of combat these narratives. Another book, I'm recommending a lot of books, but another book that highlights this well is Miriam Grossman, who was in Matt Walsh's documentary. She was the child psychiatrist that he interviewed. She came out with a book called Lost in Transnation. And in one of the appendices, she has a bunch of key studies with sort of a really brief summary about what each of the studies found, with links that you can go read them yourself. And there are several studies that combat many of the popular narratives that we've heard about this topic. The problem is that many people want to ignore that they're there or unfairly criticize the findings. And it can be intimidating if you aren't familiar with maybe more scientific language to say that.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, the studies are there and people are just scared to present them because they are very countercultural at this point.
Yeah. And so let's go through a couple of common arguments. Let me set this up as another quote from Ryan Anderson's book. He said, "Never mind that transitioning treatment has not been shown to reduce the extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts among people who identify as transgender, 41% compared with 4.6% of the general population. In fact, people who have had transition surgery are 19 times more likely than average to die by suicide. These statistics should be enough to halt the headlong rush into transitioning and prompt us to find more effective ways to prevent these tragic outcomes. Most of all, we shouldn't be encouraging children to transition or making heroes and role models out of those who have done so. And we see that very thing happening in our government, which is debased and evil. It's very degenerate behavior. And we see it being pushed throughout not just academia, but into not just in college, not just in broad discussions, but down to every level, including preschools around the nation that are accepting these kind of ideologies. So along with the social contagion, there's a few arguments that are out there that you'd brought up prior to this that I want to talk about. Why don't you go ahead and just the first argument that you see that's out there that we can kind of chat about?
Yeah, so one of the most common arguments that I've seen recently in relation to this in kids is that social transition, so independent of medical transition, there's like social transition is harmful. And even if they do start the medical transition process from being put on puberty blockers, for example, that's harmless as well and they don't really have long-term side effects. It's just sort of a pause button. And I'll address the first part first. So with social transition, so this, for those of you like to define social transition, this would include things like changing a child's pronouns, changing their name, allowing them to dress in a way that they would be perceived in public as the opposite gender. This oftentimes happens pre-puberty, so when the children are young, so that they don't necessarily need puberty blockers to quote unquote pass as the other gender. They can just dress that way. And many think that this is harmless. They say that it's harmless because the child can just easily revert to identifying their sex, at any time. But what research has shown, and Dr. Lippman talks about this in some of her papers too, is that going back to their normal reality. So if a child goes into the LGBT community and then decides that they don't want to continue or they don't feel that way or they want to sort of change course and they've socially transitioned, they've come out, so to speak, all of that, it is so hard for them to admit that to their friend groups and their parents that in some cases, in the children that she was studying, the child switched schools because they were so concerned about having to not be a part of the LGBT community or to come out not as trans to their friends, that instead of confronting their friends, their parents switched schools.
Yeah.
Think about that for a minute.
Yeah. Yep.
That's insane.
Yeah, and the peer pressure, and we're seeing that culturally where tolerance or acceptance becomes you must celebrate. It goes to celebration and ultimately domination, and where people are, I was just listening to something about this recently, but our kids are concerned with not being LGBTQ because they won't be accepted because we've so celebrated an ideology in this clown world in which we live. But continue on about the puberty blockers or a pause button. I saw on social media, and I'll probably share it on my story later today or tomorrow. There was a lady that was live streaming apparently with her teenage daughter who had just gone on testosterone. And she was asking this girl who she was trying to encourage to be a boy, how do you feel? Isn't this exciting? And it was almost like a hostage situation. It was so sad as this parent was trying to virtue signal, trying to get like cultural acceptance at the expense of their child, who was obviously like disinterested, depressed, and being chemically castrated so that as they move forward in this, they'll never experience sexual pleasure. They'll never be able to revert back, experience children. Just talk a little bit about puberty blockers or pause button, because that's being pushed. It's going to be pushed throughout the schools, also in conjunction with Planned Parenthood. If they can't, kill you off in the womb, they want to help make sure you can't reproduce after. But go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, so the long-term effects of puberty blockers, we're just reaching the tip of the iceberg right now. And we already know that they have detrimental effects to children's health. I mean, thinking about women who are put on testosterone and how it can affect their bone density, their ability to reproduce when they do get older, like you said, to experience any sort of sexual pleasure, all of that is not benign. Those are significant complications that can result from a very short period even of being on puberty blockers or taking exogenous hormones. It doesn't take very long for some of those things to begin to happen. And what we're seeing is that once children start that process, the likelihood of them then moving on to more serious things is very likely, for the same reasons I talked about before. Is once you start that process, it's a lot harder to go back. And we've heard this from detransitioners or people who were transitioned by their parents very young, sometimes not young, but oftentimes young, and then grew up and decided that they didn't actually want this. And some of them went so far as to have surgery even before the age of 18, having something like a double mastectomy done. And when we think about how that impacts gender dysphoria, if someone is truly gender dysphoric, even that is not shown to erase the gender dysphoria. And so a lot of the mental anguish that comes along with taking hormone blockers or exogenous hormones, or even worse, transitioning even further into the medicalization of it and having body parts removed and things like that, it doesn't actually fix what's going on with the psychology, which is the part that we're oftentimes missing in a lot of this, is that if someone is truly experiencing that, it's their mind is incongruent with their body, but the solution isn't always to change your body.
Yes.
You need to address the mind as well. And so the mental anguish that these people can experience is concerning, and we should all be concerned about it. Like that quote that you mentioned earlier about suicidality and things like that. We're told that it will prevent suicide, but in actuality, the rate of suicide is higher after a person is transitioned. And the argument is commonly that that's because it's not socially accepted. And to that, I would, if that comes up, what I would encourage the person to consider is, what about before? Because I would arguably say that we're the most accepting of the LGBT community than we ever have been as a country.
Sure.
Yet we see suicide rates climbing and climbing. So if it were true, then why is the suicide rate going up and not down?
Yeah.
And just ask them that, because
that's a reality, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's never been a time in history in any culture or society where the group that identifies in this way has been more celebrated than now. Yet we see the outcome is the opposite of what is said to be intended. And that's one of the common arguments. And you just said this, but just kind of restate, because there's parents where their kids are going to be confused. And I just want to say to parents for a few moments, and grandparents, if your children are on social media, they can't handle it. You should take them off immediately. You have no idea what you're working with from a propaganda standpoint, how it hacks the brain and leads them down paths. And this happens very quickly. And also, you need to be very conscientious of the relationships and the people in their world, because what seems harmless, and I'm in a great school district and none of that's happening here, I just want to say you are woefully uninformed, and respectfully, you just don't know what you're talking about. It's everywhere, and you need to lean in and really understand, because God has given you these children to steward, to disciple. You need to understand this cultural moment, what's happening, to be able to protect them accordingly from these ideologies. But if you could just speak for a moment, you had mentioned about suicidality and how that's occurring within culture, because one of the emotional manipulation tactics that's being used is that very thing. So what would you say to a parent that's right now, you got to understand, I'm concerned, what if I don't, and this child and my child goes the other direction? Just kind of talk just briefly about that. If you're comfortable for a moment, what would you say to a parent that's dealing with that?
Yeah. So I think first, I understand being concerned. I'm a mom. I understand the concern of not wanting to cause distress for your child, but also at some point you need to realize that what's going to cause harm to them is if they go down this path is going to be way more harmful. And what we're told, even by some medical professionals, which is why it's really key to have medical professionals that you trust, that you can trust, and if you're a Christian, like biblical counseling, because if your child is really psychologically distressed over this gender issue, it may just be because they are hearing so much about it, they don't know what to think,
Yeah.
and they become easily confused. Maybe they think that they are a different gender, or they might be part of the LGBT community simply because they're so young that they don't know yet. They feel like they don't like boys, maybe because they haven't even thought of that, because they're maybe 10 or 11 years old and getting slammed with this stuff, when in
Yeah.
reality they just aren't developmentally interested in the opposite sex yet.
Mm-hmm.
But because they're being inundated with this stuff so young, they automatically are going to think that something is wrong. And
Yes.
so I would just continue to speak truth into them and to hear their feelings without affirming them. You can listen to them and still point them in the right direction by telling them the truth, and by staying away from people who are going to encourage them to hide it from you, who are going to psychologically manipulate you into saying, if you don't go through with this, your child will commit suicide. Because the honestly, if your child says they're experiencing gender dysphoria and if you've never noticed any sort of anything that would even hint at them having something wrong in that area psychologically, it likely is this rapid onset gender dysphoria that I was speaking about, which is highly related to social contagion, the people that they're around and the ideas that they're consuming. So get them away from those ideas and those people as best that you can. As a parent, you're able to do that. And so I would just talk about these things with your kids, because they're going to hear it. And so if you aren't talking about it with them from your biblical worldview, they're going to hear it from a secular worldview, which is completely oppositional to what we believe. And we've spoken a lot about this, like in the past however many minutes we've been talking on this podcast, is that they're starting from a different place. They're not starting with biblical truth. They're appealing to their heart.
Mm.
And the Bible tells us the heart is deceitful.
Mm.
And so even though they're experiencing those feelings, they may be very true feelings for them. They may be real feelings. It doesn't mean they're the truth, though, with a capital T. And kids don't understand the difference. And it's our job as parents to help them understand in a loving and kind but firm way. We can't be easily manipulated, especially by people we don't trust, to tell us how to raise our kids.
Yeah, that's so good and so true. I was just thinking about this. There's someone that I think I'm going to try to bring in next year, maybe even to next year's Courage Conference, but Chloe Cole. And
Oh, yeah.
she has been around. She's 19 years old. She's a former, her Instagram page says this too, former trans kid. She started puberty blockers and testosterone at 13 years of age, double mastectomy at 15, detransed at 16, realizing this isn't true. And I think it's important for people to hear this. Kids, Sigmund Freud would say other, but he was a sick, twisted individual, should not be respected. Children are not about sexuality when they're young, and gender and they're just not. Children are not interested in sex. And if they are, it's usually due to some sort of trauma that's been introduced through molestation, other things. It's not that we're not sexual beings. It's that it's not an issue for kids in general until they come to puberty. So that's what makes this so evil, is confused adults who have an axe to grind with God and are sexually confused themselves, trying to use children as a buffer to guilt people into accepting their despicable behavior. So one more thing, and then we'll kind of bring it all together. What about people who are intersex? See, there you go. You're wrong because there's intersex people. So everything you said is wrong. So what would you say to that?
I liken this argument to when talking about like pro-life movement. Then people say, "Well, what about people who were raped?" That's like always the like gotcha thing. Is like, "Well, what about this group of people?" And the truth about intersex, or the condition of intersex, meaning that when a baby is born, there is some sort of abnormality with their sexual organs, and so at that point. And now it's a little bit different than originally, like back in the day when this happened. But at that point, they would do what we would call assigning the person's sex, and
Yeah.
so you would have to do that in order for there not to be confusion, or to the best you could help them. And so that's where this term "sex assigned at birth," I think it was John Money who actually coined that term,
Yeah.
and it was for these individuals who maybe had conflicting sexual organs. Okay. This is a very, 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 very small percent of the population. I think it's something like less than I think it's like 0.02% or something of
Mm-hmm.
of people born are intersex. And so my argument to that would be, well, why would we make the rule for the very small exception? Because most people are very clearly male or female. And so why would we change everything for something that's considered an abnormality when the 99.8% of people who aren't born intersex are just fine? It makes no sense. That logic makes no sense, to uproot and change everything we know about sex and gender because of a very, very minute portion of the population. That being said, not every child who is born intersex will struggle with gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
So that's assuming that every single person who has this really rare medical condition, that every single one of them will struggle with gender dysphoria and want to transition, which is also going to be a even smaller percentage of that group of people. And so to me, it just logically doesn't make any sense. Now, I understand that not everyone making this argument will be able to have a logical conversation with you, but I would stand firm in the logic and just say that that makes no sense. To
Mm-hmm.
make these exceptions for the very, very small amount of people who are going to struggle with this should be taken on a case-by-case basis. And oftentimes this is corrected before a child reaches toddlerhood. They want to
Yes.
do it as young as possible to eliminate any sort of trauma or psychological distress that it causes for these individuals who are born with this disorder. And it is a disorder. It's not
Yeah.
something that is normal. It's something that we see as wrong as soon as we understand that it's happening, and try to course correct as quickly as possible.
Yeah, when you try to use those arguments, just like you said with the abortion argument, I mean, the reality is, regardless how the baby came to be, whatever the starting point was, all abortion, leaves a dead baby and a traumatized woman in its wake. And when we try to use these ideas and ideologies for, in that same way, it leaves traumatized children and just a lot of terrible things in its wake. Let me say this. The best biology, psychology, and philosophy all support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality and of gender as a social manifestation of bodily sex. Biology isn't bigotry. Let's say it louder for the people in the back. Every human society has been organized around a recognition that men and women are different. And modern science shows that the differences begin with our DNA and development in the womb. It is true that men and women differ among themselves and that some people have difficulty identifying with their bodily sex, but this doesn't mean that sex is either fluid or subjective, as transgender ideology maintains. And that was from Ryan T. Anderson's book. And I think that is so important that we have a foundation and we live from that foundation, because that truth is ultimately love and kindness and brings freedom to people. In this moment of confusion and this transgender ideology that is being pushed so heavy, so strong on people, you have churches and supposed Christians changing their whole perspective, changing Scripture. But also on top of that, thousands of years of human history, like this is like a small little moment where we're trying to change the realities of everything that we know, and say if somebody believes that, they need to change their body. They can't just believe that. So there's so many things within that. But I want to bring this together because I know this is a hot topic. I know that people struggle with this because they want to be loving, they want to be kind, and you covered a variety of things. I think you did great within all of that. But speak to the Christian for a moment. Say, I just want to be loving. I just want to be kind. I don't want to enter into these discussions. I hear what you're saying. What kind of encouragement can you give to them as we bring this podcast together?
I I would just encourage you to think about what makes the most sense for you about how to address this head on, because
Yes.
I hear a lot from people, and especially I think women, that they don't want to say anything because they don't want to rock the boat, or they don't want to be perceived as unloving or not kind or whatever. But it is moms who are, in my what I've seen, are largely responsible for this when it comes to their kids. Like, I'm in a
Mm,
bunch of mom groups on Facebook, and you see these you don't really see, I don't see dads doing this as much, but they parade their trans kids around as some sort of trophy,
yeah, it's
and they
disgusting.
want to be, yeah, they want to be acknowledged for that. And I just feel like we have a lot of opportunities to plant seeds. It doesn't always have to be a whole entire conversation all at once, because the goal is not to win every single
Yeah.
conversation, but to just go along with things when you actually disagree. It's okay to just say, no, I don't actually agree with that, and leave it at that. You don't have to go into this big defense or anything like that, but simply just stating that you don't agree with something or that you think differently sometimes can make other people feel more comfortable to question anything. And so we don't have to always go out and, I don't know, do some big extravagant thing. There
Mm,
are several moments just throughout our days, throughout normal conversations that we have throughout our weeks, at wherever we are, that we can speak the truth. And this goes for any topic, but especially with this issue that's so kind of touchy. Like, this is the one thing that people don't want to talk about. And that's all the more reason that we need to talk about it, because there
yeah.
are a ton of people who don't know what to think, and they're only hearing the perspective of this is good, this is good, this is good.
Mm,
And as Christians, we know that it's not good and that God is better and the best. And so we need to be speaking God's truth into the people around us with everything, but especially with these hot button issues that no one wants to touch. If we don't touch them, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And it doesn't have to be just pastors or anything. Like, all of us have even small roles to play, and often more influential, because we're with these people.
yes.
You relate to them, you know how to approach these conversations in a way that they will receive it. So think about that, and don't be afraid to just have a conversation about it, even if you assume that the person is going to disagree with you.
That is excellent wisdom. Everybody has a platform. You make a bigger difference than you think that you do. When you speak truth, truth is powerful because Jesus is the truth, and all truth is God's truth. And when you just speak that truth and you stand for it, it has a ripple effect that's far greater than you realize. And so I appreciate you, Brittany, using your voice. Thanks for the wisdom. I hope this has been helpful for you. We're going to close just with a few recommended resources. I know that we love Cross-Examined. You've recently become an instructor for them and going through that training. Other resources that you would recommend for people to dive into this topic?
Just the books I recommended, I'll say them again. Actually, so Frank Turek, who's the president of Cross Examined, his book, Correct, Not Politically Correct, talks about homosexuality and transgenderism. So highly recommend that. It's a really easy read. Lost in Transnation was the other one that I mentioned, and then Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. And then you had mentioned When Harry Became Sally. I almost said When Harry Met Sally. When Harry Became Sally. So those books are
Yeah.
great if you're a reader or you do audiobook or whatever. I highly recommend those. They will kind of give you some encouragement and some logic behind a lot of the arguments that you hear. Some of them are more difficult reads than others, I guess, but all around this topic. Crossexamine.org, definitely, for articles and videos and examples of how to engage in these conversations effectively.
Yeah. Awesome. We need to share the truth. We need to love people. Remember, you love people that are different. We love transgender people, LGBTQ, whatever, but we are against the ideology that's lying to them and stealing their future and their eternity from them. And so have courage over cowardice. Brittany, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Hope it helped. Share it, like it, and I appreciate you for taking the time to listen. Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope this message has inspired you to courageously stand up, speak up, and to live out your faith. If you like what you heard today, give me a 5-star review, follow the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, and share it with others to learn how to stand for truth in the midst of culture.